Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Buckle up, because today we're covering a lot of ground in Spain. We've got a legal battle brewing in Madrid, a deep dive into Spain's economic situation. Plus, we'll look at some big investments happening in renewable energy. And to top it all off, we're going to unpack the housing crisis that's got young Spaniards in a real bind.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty random mix of topics at first glance, I'll admit. But as we dig into these sources you've given me, I think you'll see how these stories actually fit together to tell us a lot about what's happening in Spain right now.
Okay, so let's get right into it. You flagged this article about a legal investigation going on in Madrid, and wow, this one is a doozy. We're talking about the Attorney General of Spain, Alvaro Garcia Ortiz, and Madrid's provincial prosecutor, Pilar Rodriguez. They're both being investigated for potentially leaking some very sensitive emails.
Yeah, and these weren't just any emails. They were connected to a tax investigation into Alberto González Amador, who just so happens to be the partner of Madrid's president, Isabel Díaz Ayuso. I mean, you can imagine what a political mess this whole thing has become. Oh, absolutely. The article you shared really digs into how sensitive this situation is, and both the attorney general and the prosecutor are denying any wrongdoing. Of course, Rodriguez is even claiming that something like 60 people had access to these emails, including the cleaning staff.
Right, so it really begs the question, was this a legitimate security breach or something more deliberate? And if it was intentional, what was the motive behind it? Was it politically motivated? This case has really stirred things up and sparked a lot of debate about transparency within the Spanish government.
It definitely makes you think about the trust people have in their institutions, especially when you consider the economic uncertainty that's looming over everything. And speaking of the economy, you included some reports on Spain's current financial situation. And it looks like even with some salary increases happening, a lot of Spanish workers are actually struggling to make ends meet.
That's because the cost of living is rising faster than wages. It's like they're running on a treadmill. They're putting in the effort, but not really getting anywhere. Your sources highlight that over the last 16 years, prices have gone up by almost 34%, while wages haven't kept pace at all.
And you specifically mentioned this article about teachers having a hard time making ends meet. It seems like they're a perfect example of what you called earlier the purchasing power squeeze. Their salaries just haven't been able to keep up with the rising cost of housing, food, you name it.
Exactly. And middle management, like those teachers, are getting hit particularly hard.
Yeah.
The data shows they've lost as much as 17 points of purchasing power, which is a pretty significant blow to their financial stability.
So even people who are typically considered to be relatively well off are feeling the pinch. What does this mean for the overall health of the Spanish economy?
Well, it's definitely a cause for concern. When people are constantly losing purchasing power, it can have ripple effects throughout the entire economy. Consumer spending might go down, businesses might hold back on investing and expanding, and ultimately economic growth could slow down. It's a tricky situation to be in.
It's not exactly the most optimistic outlook, but on a more positive note, you also send over some articles about a sudden surge in renewable energy investments in Spain. It seems like some companies are going all in on a greener future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One big example of this is Movi, which used to be known as Cepsa. They're investing a massive $600 million to build 30 biomethane plants across Spain by 2030. Their focus is on regions like Andalusia, Catalonia, and Galicia, which have a lot of potential for this type of renewable energy production.
Biomethane, that's the renewable natural gas made from organic waste, right? One of the articles you shared mentioned that it can be used within existing natural gas infrastructure, which could make the transition a lot smoother.
Exactly. It's like swapping out a dirty old engine for a brand new clean one without having to redesign the entire car. MUE estimates these biomethane plants will generate enough energy to power over 500,000 homes and significantly reduce CO2 emissions.
Now, those are some impressive numbers, and this isn't even the only major renewable energy news coming out of Spain. Repsol is also planning to invest $800 million in a renewable methanol plant in Tarragona. It looks like Spain is taking some big steps towards clean energy.
It definitely seems that way. Both renewable methanol and biomethane have the potential to be used across various industries, making them powerful tools in the fight against climate change.
So even with all the economic hurdles, it's really encouraging to see Spain making such significant investments in a sustainable future. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the other pressing issue you wanted to cover, the housing crisis affecting young people in Spain. The report from the Spanish Youth Council you sent over doesn't paint a very rosy picture.
No, it doesn't. And this issue really ties back to those economic struggles we were just talking about. When people are already grappling with a shrinking purchasing power, finding affordable and decent housing becomes an even bigger mountain to climb, especially for young people who are just starting out.
The report really emphasizes how widespread this problem is for young Spaniards. 1 in 3 who manage to move out of their family homes needs some kind of financial assistance just to pay rent. It's hard to imagine the pressure that puts on individuals and their families.
It's a huge burden. And it's especially tough on young women who tend to face even greater financial strain when it comes to housing. The report also points out that almost half of emancipated young people are spending more than 40% of their income on rent.
hmm
That's a massive chunk of their earnings, especially considering that many of them are making less than the 1,000 euros a month.
You also highlighted some personal stories from young people who are struggling to find decent, affordable housing in Madrid. One young woman described having to move 3 times in the last year alone because of rent hikes and terrible living conditions. These stories really bring home the human cost of this crisis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
High rent, coupled with poor living conditions and the constant need to move, can have a really negative impact on people's mental health, their ability to hold down a steady job, their overall well-being. It's a tough cycle to break out of.
So, we've covered a lot of territory today. We've got political intrigue, economic anxieties, a glimmer of hope in the renewable energy sector, and this looming housing crisis. It's a lot to take in, but do you see any connections running through these seemingly separate stories? We uncovered some pretty major challenges facing Spain. So, let's dig a little deeper here. What are the potential long term consequences of all this, and is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, that's the million-euro question, isn't it? Maybe we can start by going back to that legal case in Madrid. You pointed out how this potential scandal has really shaken people's trust in the government.
Yeah, the article talked about how this investigation, no matter what the outcome ends up being, could really damage public trust. And this is happening in a political climate that's already pretty divided.
Exactly. And if you combine that with all the economic anxieties we've been discussing, it creates a perfect storm for disillusionment. People might become more likely to believe populist rhetoric or latch onto quick-fix solutions that don't actually address the root causes of these very complex problems.
So this is about more than just one isolated case. It's about the potential ripple effects that could impact the entire system. And what about the economic side of things? We talked about how Spanish workers are losing purchasing power. If that trend continues, what could happen?
Well, one immediate concern is that living standards could start to decline. People might have to make really difficult choices about cutting back on essential things, maybe put off big life decisions, or even take on more debt just to stay afloat. You highlighted a report that mentioned Spain's rising poverty rate, especially among families with young children. That's a direct consequence of these economic pressures.
It's heartbreaking to think about families having to choose between feeding their children and keeping a roof over their heads. That decline in living standards can spiral into even bigger economic problems, can it?
Absolutely. As people are forced to tighten their belts, consumer spending goes down, and that has a direct impact on businesses, potentially leading to slower economic growth, job losses, and a whole host of other problems. It's a vicious cycle that can be incredibly difficult to break.
It's a stark reminder that economic problems have a very real impact on people's lives. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about those investments in renewable energy we discussed earlier. You provided some great articles on that topic. If those projects are successful, what kind of positive impact could they have on Spain's economy and its environment?
Well, for the economy, a thriving renewable energy sector could lead to a whole bunch of new jobs. It could attract foreign investment and boost innovation. It could also help Spain become less reliant on fossil fuels, which would make it less vulnerable to those volatile global energy markets.
So it's a potential win-win for the economy and the environment.
In theory, yes. But it's important to remember that making the transition to a cleaner energy system isn't always easy. One of the articles you shared highlighted the challenges that workers in those traditional energy sectors might face. As Spain moves away from fossil fuels, it's crucial to make sure those workers aren't left behind. Retraining programs and other support systems will be essential.
That's a great point. And then there's also the issue of making sure that these renewable energy projects are developed in a way that benefits local communities.
Right. We have to think about things like land use, environmental impact, and community engagement. These projects should create opportunities for those local communities, not displace them or disrupt their way of life.
It's a good reminder that even when we're working towards positive goals like sustainability, it's so important to consider the potential unintended consequences. And that brings us back to that housing crisis, which seems to be deeply connected to the economic challenges we've been discussing.
Absolutely. You pointed out a really insightful opinion piece that argued that if we don't address the underlying economic problems, any solutions to the housing crisis will just be a band-aid.
The author made a very strong case for the need for better wages and job security so that young people can actually afford to live on their own.
Exactly. And along those lines, the Spanish Youth Council's report recommends a multifaceted approach to tackling this housing crisis. They suggest increasing the supply of affordable housing, strengthening protections for tenants, and providing financial assistance to those who are struggling to pay rent.
Those are all really critical steps, but as you mentioned earlier, it takes political will and resources to make those things happen.
And that's where informed citizens like our listeners come in. By understanding the complexities of these issues, engaging in thoughtful discussions, and holding their elected officials accountable, they can become powerful advocates for change.
So even though these challenges seem huge, there's still reason for optimism.
Absolutely. Progress might be slow, and there will definitely be bumps along the way, but change is possible. By shedding light on these issues, promoting constructive dialogue, and refusing to accept the status quo, we can work towards a future where all Spaniards have the opportunity to thrive.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future, no matter how small it might seem. But before we wrap up, there's one last piece of this puzzle to consider. How does all of this impact Spain's place on the world stage?
That's a fantastic question. We've spent this deep dive examining Spain's internal challenges, but how do those pressures influence the country's relationships with other nations? How is Spain positioning itself globally in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar and unpredictable?
Okay, so we've spent all this time looking at the stuff happening inside Spain. You know, the political drama, the economic worries, the energy transition, and of course that housing crisis that's got young people in a real tough spot. But now I kind of want to zoom out, like way out. What about Spain's place in the world? Like, how does all this stuff affect Spain on that bigger global stage?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like we're shifting from looking through a microscope to using a telescope.
Hmm.
And actually, you sent me some really interesting articles about Spain's foreign policy goals and some of the challenges they're facing globally.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What's the world looking like these days, and where does Spain fit into all of that?
Well, to put it simply, we're living in a time of some pretty major changes when it comes to geopolitics. The balance of power is in flux, things are shifting, and the world is becoming increasingly multipolar. And that creates both new opportunities and a whole set of new challenges for a country like Spain as they try to figure out their place in this new world order.
You mentioned opportunities there. What kind of opportunities are on the table for Spain?
One of Spain's biggest strengths is that they act as a kind of bridge between Europe and Latin America. They have deep historical and cultural ties with Latin American countries, which puts them in a good position to build economic and political partnerships.
And one of the articles you sent me talked about how Spain's trying to use its expertise in renewable energy to become a major player in the global clean energy market.
Exactly. They're putting themselves forward as a leader in the fight against climate change, and they're hoping that attracts investment and helps to create new jobs in this growing sector.
So it sounds like Spain's ready to make a real splash on that global stage. But here's the thing. How do all those internal challenges we talked about affect Spain's ability to reach those ambitious goals?
That is the big question, isn't it? I mean, if Spain's dealing with political instability, if their economy is shaky, if there's unrest at home, it makes it harder to project strength and unity to the rest of the world. It's like trying to promote a product that's still in beta, you know?
Yeah, you need a strong foundation at home before you can really make your mark on the world. And one of the articles pointed out that Spain's economic struggles might actually limit their options when it comes to foreign policy.
Exactly. If a big chunk of the government's budget is going towards things like addressing the housing crisis or trying to boost the economy, well, there's simply less money available for other things like diplomatic initiatives or development aid or military spending.
So it's a real balancing act. How can Spain deal with all these problems at home and at the same time achieve its goals on that global stage?
Yeah. Well, it takes careful planning. You have to prioritize your goals and be realistic about what you can actually achieve. Maybe Spain needs to narrow its focus a bit when it comes to foreign policy. Instead of trying to do it all, maybe they should hone in on a few key areas, like strengthening those relationships within the European Union, or really building up ties with a specific region like Latin America.
So it's about choosing quality over quantity. And one of the articles suggested that Spain could really use its strengths to its advantage. Things like its cultural diplomacy, its incredible food, its history of innovation to enhance its global standing.
Absolutely. Highlighting those unique strengths can really help with building relationships and shaping global perceptions of Spain.
It feels like Spain's at a turning point right now, facing some really tough choices about where to go from here.
Yeah. That's true. The decisions they make in the next few years, both at home and internationally, are going to have a big impact on Spain's future.
So, what's the takeaway for our listeners today? What can they do with all this information?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that even though we've been talking about all these big, complex global issues, it all really comes back to individuals. It comes back to informed, engaged citizens. By understanding the challenges facing Spain, by asking the right questions, by holding their leaders accountable, individuals can play a huge role in shaping a better future for their country.
It's a good reminder that we all have a part to play in creating a more just equitable and sustainable world, both within our own borders and on that global stage. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Spain. We hope you've come away with a clearer understanding of all the factors shaping Spain's future.